Hello and welcome. It is difficult to believe that 2022 is fast approaching, and we are already in the throes of planning mode again, trying to continue the momentum that we started in 2021 and carry that into 2022. For all of you who have joined us today, thank you so much for being here. No matter the term, we are all very familiar with the greatest job shift on record, which was spurred by how the pandemic forced significant changes to how we work. These shifts are continuing, and the biggest question out there is, once the dust has settled, how will the new world of work look? And specifically, how will it change the world of hiring and retention? And what can organizations do to stand out in this new world? And that is what we are here to discuss today. I'm Courtney Patterson, content strategist at Dice, and I am joined today by Kathryn Minshew, founder and CEO of The Muse, and our very own CEO of Dice, Zeile. These are two incredible experts on careers and tech careers, and we could not be more excited to have them here with us today for this discussion. Before we start, I would like everyone to know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will be providing a recording of this webinar via email in about 24 hours after the webinar ends. All attendees are currently muted, but please feel free to drop questions and comments into the chat box on your screen. We've allotted 60 minutes for this webinar, but if we have any additional time there at the end, we will go to the chat for any questions that the audience has posed. So make sure you drop those in there throughout the webinar as you think of them. Now, as we start off the discussion, I'd love for the audience to hear from both of our panelists. Each of you, if you wouldn't mind just giving a short introduction and a bit about the organizations that you lead. Kathryn, let's start with you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am very excited to be joining today because this is obviously a topic that I care a lot about. So I'm, as you said, Kathryn Minshew, founder and CEO of The Muse. And The Muse is a next generation career site that is really focused on helping people identify their personal values, preferences, and priorities, and then research companies and careers to find the right fit for them. So we work on one side with millions of people every month who are coming to The Muse to search for jobs, research companies, get great career advice and deeper resources. A lot of people who are using The Muse are Gen Z and millennial candidates, and we really tend to specialize in people looking for full-time roles. So entry-level, mid-level, everything from engineering and technical roles to sales and marketing, et cetera. So that's a lot of my area of expertise. And then obviously, we also work with employers to help them really capture employee stories, data, content, information that can illuminate their company culture, their employer brand, and really give candidates on the outside a much better sense of what it's like to work there, so that ultimately we're not making just any old hire, but really kind of high quality, really retained good fit hires.
Great.
Fantastic. And thank you very much, Courtney, for having us here. I'm Art Zeile, the CEO of DHI Group. DHI Group consists of two brands, Dice, as well as Clearance Jobs. They both facilitate the same basic value proposition, which is to say that we help recruiters find technologists. And technologists are a very different part of this economy right now, and has been for quite some time. So we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about how maybe some of these questions that are being posed are a little bit differently answered when it comes to the technology community. I'm a longtime entrepreneur, I would say. I think I bring that spirit to DHI Group and fundamentally believe in the mission, which is to really help both recruiters find the right people to transform their business, but also for candidates to find the right career opportunity that can, in fact, transform their lives. So look forward to the discussion to come.
Great. Thank you both so much. Since an hour is not nearly enough time to focus on every topic around the future of work, and because of the experts that we do have here today, we are going to focus specifically on brand. And brand can be one of those blanket terms that can mean something different depending on your lens and the moment that you're in, the situation that you're in. So in just a moment, I will ask both of our panelists to share their own definitions for the term to kind of give us a starting point. But first, just to mention that while some organizations spend quite a bit of time working on their brand, others don't make it as high a priority. But we would argue that in this time of worker leverage and the revolution that we're seeing in terms of how people want to work instead of how organizations want them to work, brand has taken on more and more importance. All else being equal, your brand, which encompasses things like your culture, your stances on key issues, your diversity of your team, your commitment to innovation, and just generally what it's like to work at your organization. That's all become very critical in being a differentiating factor in a market where skilled professionals are in extreme demand. So essentially, branding is no longer nice to have. It's more vital to attracting and retaining talent today. So today, our panelists will talk about the fundamental shifts in how employees are making choices about where they work next and how organizations can create and provide the type of opportunities that will entice the right candidate to fill their most important roles. We have some questions prepared for both Kathryn and Art separately, and some questions that we'll ask for both of them to respond to. And like I mentioned, if time permits, we will go to the chat. So please make sure you add any questions or comments that you have throughout the discussion to the chat box. So let's begin. As I mentioned, to start off, just gonna get our videos here, front and center. To start off, I would love for each of you to share how you define the term brand and talk a little bit about how companies can demonstrate their values and their mission to prospective candidates. Kathryn, we'll go to you first.
Great. So simply put, I like to define brand as what people say about you when you're not in the room. So how do people describe you? What language do they use? What attributes or adjectives do they attribute to you? And I think one of the things about employer brand that is so tricky is that when we started talking about the concept, there was a really strong desire on behalf of a lot of employers to fully control it and to own it. But the fact is, that's simply not possible in today's world, right? Your employees, any candidate who interacts with your employer brand as they go through the interview process, they all have something to contribute, and many of them are contributing, like it or not, to that broader conversation. I do think fundamentally this is a good thing because, as we'll talk about later in this webinar, I'm a huge believer in the benefits for an employer of really understanding the true reality of your employee experience and being able to communicate that authentically outward. But I think if you think about your brand as how people talk about you when you're not in the room, it allows you to contribute to the conversation, but also to recognize that controlling it is not only futile, but I think you will often end up with worse results if you try and exert too much control. At the same time, when you take the time to really understand what is your brand today, not what you would like it to be, not what you aspire to make it in the future, but what is it today, it's also easier to chart a course. The second thing that I think I just want to quickly touch on when we talk about brand is I think that the world is moving towards more specificity and more detail in brands. So some of the least effective brands that I see today are, trying to be everything to everyone. They're using kind of huge, vague, unspecific words versus companies that can really zero in on the part of the market they want to target or how they want to be seen by their employees, by their candidates. The more specific, the more real, the more I think intentional you can be, the more likely you are to play a big role in that conversation that people are having about you when you're not in the room.
I think those are all fantastic points, Kathryn. And when I think about brand, I think to this one definition that I heard years ago that was delivered by Seth Godin. He said, a brand is a set of expectations, memories, stories and relationships that, taken together, account for a customer's decision to choose one product or service over another. And I'd go to a further extent to say that that brand also is very meaningful for investors, for stakeholders in general, for your internal team members, and the community itself. And so there's a lot of distinct elements to a brand. I think that the most important propositions associated with a brand are demonstrating your mission and your values. And you have to be consistent in doing so. You have to be transparent and also focused. I think that a brand effectively is a relationship between an employee and an employer, or as we say it internally to DHI, a team member and the company itself. And in order for that relationship to be successful, like any kind of a relationship, you want to make sure that there's trust and that there is a feeling of caring for the other individual. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can do that in today's day and age, that the age of the pandemic. At DHI Group, in the form of trust, we are very transparent with our company. Every single Tuesday, I have an all-hands meeting. I just had my all-hands meeting literally about 2 or 3 hours ago, and we answer questions that are open questions. They're all anonymous, and that's just one element of trust, making sure that people have clear communication from the company and that they essentially have the ability to question the strategy, the tactics, everything that's going on inside of the company itself. I think when it comes to caring about people, I think that's a really important element of what's necessary to build a brand and to essentially be successful in any company, but especially those companies that want to gain the access and trust of technologists. I think that in the last 18 months, companies have shown that they cared in a lot of different ways. They have to do it genuinely. Like, I'll give you some examples because I think it's important to get some ideas that are concrete on the table. When I think about caring, this year in particular, we made possible a stipend for people to work from home. We have a hybrid environment where people can either come into the office or they can work from home. It's either or. It's a matter of where they set the dividing line as to how much time they want in the office versus being at home. And so that stipend of $150 per quarter gives them the opportunity to buy a better chair, to buy paper that's used in their printers, to do the things that optimize their office environment. Another big element of showing that we care, I think, is in the form of providing mental health days. And I do think that people have been unfortunately suffering a lot by virtue of the way that the world has changed. And many people feel isolated when they're working from home. And so the idea of having extra time to essentially focus on yourself is super critical, in my opinion. So as an example, we gave off 2 mental health days right before Labor Day to extend the Labor Day weekend to 5 days in total. But I think those are the kind of elements of brand that are important, is to gain the trust and caring nature of a relationship, and that ultimately that's manifested in the way that the people around us as companies really think about the nature of work and what it's like to be there at that company.
Great, that's a great way to start off, just understanding how you both approach the term brand. Art, thanks for those great examples as well in terms of how DHI is showing up or exhibiting the values and mission that they're communicating to their employees. Kathryn, this next question is for you specifically. As I mentioned in the introduction, it's no secret that workers have more leverage than ever. In your opinion, what are some of the best ways that employers and recruiters can help job seekers use that leverage to grow as individuals and to find their dream jobs to enhance their careers?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a few big trends here that are impacting the situation we find ourselves in, right? One is the increasing sort of social consciousness or values consciousness of particularly Gen Z workers. When Deloitte recently released their 2021 survey on millennial and Gen Z beliefs, one of the interesting statistics for me was that I think it was 44% of millennials said they had made choices over the recent past about the type of work that they would do or the organizations that they would work for based on their personal ethics. So 44% of millennials, 49% of Gen Z. And this is something that really it correlates with what we're seeing on the Muse, which is that people are much more comfortable voting with their feet about their values. We also live in a world that is becoming increasingly personalized in almost everything we do, right? If any of us were to log on to a media platform, listen to Spotify or watch a movie on Netflix, a lot of these tools that we use in our day-to-day life are architected around our personal preferences. And so it makes sense that a lot of individuals are asking themselves, well, wait a second, what are my personal preferences as an individual? How do they align with what's offered by my employer? So I think to your question about what employers or recruiters can do, I think that it is helpful to both understand what are the things that your employees really care about? What are their core values and their core preferences? Which ones can you support or align with as an employer? And which ones can't you? And again, first of all, the information is incredibly valuable because you can't make great decisions if you don't have any data. Once you do have some information, you can start to say, well, who do I want to be as an employer? And I think it is important to recognize that you cannot be everything to everyone. One small example of that I've discussed before, but that I think is really relevant is we've all seen the statistics about the percentage of people who want to work in an office, the percentage of people who want to work fully remotely or distributed, and the percentage of people who want to work in a hybrid fashion. What's really interesting is that underlying those percentages is the fact that many individuals want their teammates and colleagues to do work in the same way that they want to. So it's not enough for their employer to say, here's an office, you're welcome to come in. They don't want to go into an empty office. They want to go in at the same time as a lot of their teammates go in. It's not enough for many people if their employer says you can stay distributed if everyone else is going to be congregating in person. That's not always an easy thing to work through. And so I think companies, leaders, recruiters, employers are going to have to be very, very clear about who they are, what their workplace environment is like, what they can offer and what they can't. Because I think what we're going to see, we see it in the data today, and I believe this trend is only going to increase as as it snowballs, as access to this information increases, is that a lot of workers are better retained, more productive, more engaged, more satisfied when, firstly, what they value, how they work is aligned with what their employer offers, which is why communicating this information is so important. And so retention goes up, engagement goes up, satisfaction goes up when you can create that alignment between your workforce and your organization. But what is one of the most important steps of that process? It's actually communicating to candidates before they choose you what it's going to be like to work here, what you do offer. And that, I think, is obviously that's the subject of our conversation today, but I think that is the most important thing because it is very hard to come back from someone who joins your organization and feels like they have not gotten the full story. And I think that younger generations have less tolerance for that. There is more expectation that they should be able to do the research up front and then have the experience match somewhat of the expectations. I will say, like, most candidates do not expect a workplace to be perfect. They don't expect perfection, but they do expect some level of transparency, as Art said, of authenticity, as I talked about. And so I think that is one of the most important things that any leader today can think about doing as they're looking at this brave new world.
That's so interesting. I hadn't thought about the personalization in our personal lives and how we consume data and consume media, influencing how we perceive the workplace. Really insightful. Thank you. Art, this next question is for you. How should employers think about and approach optimizing how they show up in the marketplace, specifically to in-demand technologists?
Well, I'd say that the technology sector of the economy is very distinctly different than a lot of the other places that you can essentially see a career unfold. And when I think back to pre-pandemic days, like literally February of last year, the unemployment rate for technologists was roughly 1.3%, so substantially below the national average. That rose to about 3% during the pandemic, and now is down to 1.5%. So technologists know that they have leverage. They know that they have a high demand for their skill sets. And so again, I think it's a distinct community. I think that the bottom line is that when I think about technologists, I think that they are perceived to have always wanted to have this work from home environment before the pandemic. And a lot of people just basically think, hey, these guys are wearing their headphones, sitting in these massive open office environments. Why do they need to be here if they just are immersed in their kind of flow space and doing their development work? And technologists, incidentally, is a category, so it's more than just developers, but a big percentage of the folks that we track on the DICE and ClearanceJob platforms are developers, in fact. So one of the things that I want to dispel is that people still want flexibility. We did a survey of technologists in 2020. It was a technologist sentiment survey, as well as one this year, and we found that this year, 2021, roughly 17% of technologists said that they want to be in the office full time. And so I just point that out to say that all people are not monolithic. They're not, going to answer the question the exact same way. And I think that having flexibility in delivering that flexibility in terms of the work environment is critical at this stage. In fact, my board director, a guy named Max Carnecchia, who works for a company called MyTech, which is a software development company in San Diego, he believes that his flexibility is going to be the key to poaching key talent in California over the next 2 years as other companies decide that they have to be hybrid. And so that's just one example of how the technology community is distinctly different. It isn't monolithic. The second thing that I would mention that I think is really super critical for how people present themselves in the career marketplace, if they're hunting for technologists, is the importance of learning and development. So as part of that same survey that I just described, we found that 45% of the respondents believe that they're getting the learning and development opportunities that they need, compared to 68% that said that they want it. So there's a gap out there in terms of the opportunities that are being presented to technologists. And again, the technology community is different in the sense that skills have a half-life of roughly 5 years. I always joke about the fact that when I came out of the Air Force and started my career, I worked for a Silicon Valley-based software company, and I was programming in Fortran. There are no postings on DICE for Fortran. So it's really critical for technologists to understand that they are getting the latest, greatest training, and they're in an environment where they can succeed not only now, but in the future. So again, the two vectors that I would offer would be that, idea that you have to have flexibility around the work environment, and it's not just remote, only, but people do want to come in. And also the idea that for technologists, it's a constant learning environment, and expressing that in intelligent ways is going to allow people to be attracted to your opportunities.
Those are all really good points. Thank you so much, Art. This next question has multiple parts, and I'm going to pose it to both of you. Kathryn, will go to you first, just as a heads up. Many professionals, including technologists, they have been evaluating what they want from work, their jobs, their careers, and after going through the pandemic, in many ways, this is changing the future of work, with organizations kind of adjusting to the wants and needs of job seekers, like we've been talking about. So the pendulum has kind of shifted in the workers' realm. What are each of your thoughts on what now matters most to employees? We've kind of talked a little bit about this already. And how can organizations put changes in place that get to more of that balance of creating environments where both organizations and employees are working at their most optimal levels?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to give a very enthusiastic +1 to a lot of what you just said, because I think it is so tempting for people to approach this question and say, you know, Kathryn, tell us, like, what are the 3 things that everybody wants? But everybody doesn't want the same 3 things, and that makes it really hard in some ways. It's also, though, a huge opportunity because, as Art was saying, you have subpopulations in different areas that have different preferences. And if you make a really distinct decision about whether your company is going to be fully in person, fully distributed, hybrid in a certain way, it's not going to help you win every candidate, but it likely will help you win the candidates who are looking for that thing. And so, when we surveyed Muse users recently, which, as I said, we tend to really skew Gen Z, millennial. It's a very, very diverse population who uses the Muse, mostly full-time role. When we ask them, when you're searching for a new job, which factors are most important? Flexibility and work-life balance came up as number 1. Not incredibly surprising given what we've seen with COVID and these kind of really important conversations around the way that work gets done and the flexibility given to employees to pursue it. Coming in a close second was learning and growth opportunities. So very much echoing, Art, your data from DHI, that people really are prioritizing their ability to move forward in their career, and they're asking questions like, what can this employer teach me? What experiences will I have? What skills will I learn? And so leaning into that as an employer is, I think, very, very important, frankly, for all demographics, but I would say we see it most intensely in earlier career professionals who are looking to move up and to focus on their professional development. And then interestingly, the third factor that came up really high in what people are considering as they're thinking about changing jobs is the team culture and the people that they would be working with every day. And I loved seeing that come up so high. It actually came up ahead of compensation, which I thought was fascinating, because it is part of why I started the Muse in the first place. And I think that it's something that for a long time was underlooked as a really key component of employee satisfaction. But it is true that organizations have personalities. There are styles of how work gets done. And the more that you can identify how your organization operates, understand if that is aligned with how you want to operate, and then communicate externally what the experience of working at your company is like, so that people know what to expect. I think the more successful you're going to be. And so, I think that that broadly speaking, those are kind of the big 3: the flexibility and work-life balance, learning and growth opportunities, and then the team culture and people environment that you're working in day out. But again, there's a lot of different areas where, again, you may not win every single candidate, but you could identify a specific subset. So we also see a lot of people looking for specific benefits and perks. There's been a lot of competition around parental leave, fertility benefits, elder care or child care benefits, a lot of different companies thinking about how to reimagine their benefits package to better serve their employees. We obviously see alignment with a company's bigger purpose or mission as something that is, again, consistently very, very high. And then I think there's a lot of opportunity, particularly for smaller companies, I think, to stake a really distinct piece of ground around some of their unique work styles, quirks, traditions, and use that as well to communicate externally some of the key elements of why someone would choose you. Because the fact is, as I think everyone knows here, we are in the most competitive environment for talent that that I have ever seen, that I think many people working in the talent field have seen. And unfortunately, I don't think we're at the end. I read an article on CNBC, I think last week, that said we might be at the end of the Great Resignation. And I thought, like, oh, that's so cute that you think so. But every data point that I have indicates that unless there is another major COVID-related shock that pulls us back into recession, that the trend of resignations and job change will continue through minimum the first half of 2022, possibly longer. And again, especially as companies start to think about their return to office plans, they start to formalize how work will get done in a post-COVID environment, that is going to essentially spark another wave of change with employees that feel unhappy with the choices that have been made. And again, I think it is fundamentally impossible to make every single employee happy with a work from home hybrid distributed plan, because you will always have some folks that feel like there are not enough of their colleagues doing the same thing that they've chosen. Unless, I guess the one exception could be if you were a certain type of company before and you've been if you were fully distributed pre-COVID and you're committed to staying fully distributed and you've messaged that very completely all the way through, you will probably be able to be spared some of this. But that's a pretty small number of companies, and I think most of us will have to surf the waves of resignations and understand how to attract new folks that are here for the long haul, not just taking a job because it's in front of them.
Excellent answer, and multiple thoughts there, Kathryn. I wanted to build off of one, which is the importance of culture. And in my opinion, one of the real differentiators today specifically is whether or not a company can be rightfully considered a listening culture. I think based on the radical changes that we've seen over the last 18 months, that is a true differentiator in today's day and world. I can tell you that we have done probably on the order of a dozen plus internal surveys just to try to understand the sentiment that people have around going to the office, like what kind of conditions we should have, what kind of safety measures, all kinds of things. And that's in addition to our standard engagement survey, which is the Gallup Q12 survey, which I think is an excellent survey, obviously delivered to literally hundreds of thousands of companies over the course of time. So it's a pretty valid statistical database. But that idea of being able to listen and to understand what it means to engage differently now in today's environment that is much more hybrid than it might have been in the past. Obviously, for our company, it's very hybrid, and I would have said 98% of the time people were in the office prior to the pandemic. So it was that big of a shift. But the idea of what you do to engage people should be not a dictatorial or like an Air Force hierarchical kind of set of directions or directives. It should be a matter of talking to people, having these kind of engagement surveys, and then making choices afterwards. I think that is a big part of what is going to attract people in the future, is just saying, my voice has been heard. And I am not in a company that is having that kind of hierarchical militaristic view of what they should be doing and how they should be performing inside of an office environment or outside of it.
That's great. And I'm curious of both of these answers that were shared, taking the question a little bit further, how can organizations make sure that the changes that are made right now are still intact 5, 10, 20 years down the road? Obviously, some changes will be made, but fundamentally, how do organizations make sure that those changes, they remain committed to them?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first. I think that culture is demonstrated in the hard decisions, right? It's easy to say, we care about this, we believe in this, but the times when your culture is really tested are the times when it's defined. And that means when a high performer violates norms of your values or your culture in how you treat people, or when the interests of your stakeholders are in conflict and there were no easy answers. And so I think that in order to really build for the long haul, I think, first of all, I know I just keep +1ing everything that Art is saying, but I think obviously we're very aligned in a lot of this. Like, the listening is important first, because so many companies start the process of defining their values and their culture by putting a small group of executives in a room, and they have these great ideas, and they come out and they're like, guess what? We've defined our culture, we've defined our values. And by and large, when that happens, often people at other places within the organization, a lot of the people doing your actual work are like, what? It creates a disconnect between the lived experience of people at the organization and the idealistic values. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a role for a group of executives in a room. Of course there is. That's a very key part of the process, but it has to be, I think, often preceded by and sort of interwoven with listening to people at all levels of your organization. And I think once then you come to a consensus as an organization through a process that is not just top down, but that is somewhat bottom up as well, then I think you have to say, for these values to have any meaning, for these cultural changes to take root and last, we have to embed them into our performance management system, our compensation, our hiring and firing decisions. So I think the companies that do this really effectively, they think about how do I ensure when I'm hiring that we are screening for alignment with key organizational values in addition to screening for skill. They ask questions like, when people are up for promotion, do we look at whether they are doing their jobs in accordance with our key company values? You know, if someone is high performing and and also demonstrably violating certain company values, do you promote that person anyway? How is that handled? There are no easy answers. It would be much easier for all of us if there were, but I think those tough decisions are what demonstrate to a broader workforce that management is serious, because there is such a I think there's a lot of companies where values are just a nice poster on the wall. And so it's not unexpected that many employees would be cynical. And so I think the onus is on leaders, executives, managers to ensure that the values and the culture that you're talking about is also the one that is lived. And I was a few weeks ago speaking to a group of HR leaders, and someone said, well, what do I do if there's a gap between what my executives are saying and what they're doing? And I think part of what we talked through was that there are ways of making sure people are aware of the gap, getting data to help reinforce that there is a gap, and getting buy-in from leadership to both perhaps change what they're saying and help change what's actually happening to come together. But at the end of the day, the panel of other HR leaders that I was on said, if leadership is too far away from employee experience and too unwilling to come together, in some cases the answer may be to look for a new company, because I think fundamentally it's going to be very hard for organizations to be successful where there is a really large gap between professed ideals and lived experience, because employees have a lot of tools and forums to point out the gap. And I think there's less tolerance for what one might call, perceived hypocrisy. Again, it's not that perfection is the standard. No one is going to hit that. But I think that employees can sense a real difference between organizations that are genuinely working to listen and to make changes versus those that want to write something nice down, stick it to the wall, and be done.
So just following up on Kathryn, I think that answer is perfect. In fact, when I think about the longevity of a culture, it really comes down to having a clearly defined mission, vision, set of values, and having every single leader, every single person in the team for that matter, really live those mission, vision, statement, and values. And in fact, I was laughing when you described how some people would just stick a couple people in the room and say, hey, we just came up with our values. My very first day on the job, I was here in my New York City office, literally meeting with my VP of HR as my first meeting of my first day. And I said to her, can I get the values of the company? Can I get anything that defines them? And she says, oh, they're up on our walls, but you don't want to see them. And I said, well, why? And she said, well, our chief strategy officer wrote them himself in his own office and didn't consult anybody. And so I said, well, that's not going to work. So we essentially created a very broad cross-functional team, cross-geography team to essentially describe what we felt we should achieve in terms of our values. Our values are make good things happen, one team, innovate with purpose, win together, end each day with pride. And now we have an award program that essentially focuses on peer recognition, where any person in the company can put in a nomination. I just called for nominations for the end of the fourth quarter today at our one team huddle. And those nominations are tied to our values. So you have to describe the value that is being delivered by that particular recognition. And our awards program is something that everybody looks forward to every single quarter. It culminates in 3 to 5 people that actually attend President's Club with our sales performers, our top sales performers each year. And we also added a bucket list award. So the top award winner now gets their top kind of activity on their bucket list. So I think recognizing values that are inherent in the company's success, but making sure that everybody lives them is absolutely the best way of effectively making sure that a culture remains on track.
Thank you both. Incredibly insightful. Kathryn, this next question is for you. One of the most important elements in how employers show up as a brand, and one that you have actually been advocating since the very beginning of The Muse, has been that the outward-facing brand must reflect the culture that is within an organization. What are some ways that you've seen companies shift their thinking to this caring first, like we were talking about earlier, mentality since the onset of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of changes. Some of them forced by our kind of changing circumstances of so many people working remotely, and some of them a response to the spread of information around company behavior. So one of the changes that I've seen post the onset of COVID is that obviously when employees are distributed, when everyone was working in 2020 in particular from their homes or from more isolated locations, employers could no longer rely on a fancy office or a ping pong table to stand in for their culture. And frankly, they never should have been overly relying on those aspects because, you know, a free snack depot is not culture. But when you don't have some of the same glitz and glam or beautiful office shots, which, by the way, I recognize the irony, right? Part of how The Muse first built a following is that we let you see inside the offices of companies all around the world. And people do love that. It's an important piece of the puzzle. It's just not the only piece of the puzzle. And so companies started struggling and saying, well, how do I communicate what it's like to work here if I can't let someone into my office? If I don't have the experience of bringing a candidate in for a day of interviews and having them just sort of pick up a feel of things by osmosis, you had to be much more intentional about culture. And, you know, one of the things we did right when COVID hit was we sped up the development of a product we had been working on at The Muse, which allowed employees to record short videos on their phones or laptops from anywhere about what it was like to work at a company. And we wanted it to be very, very simple to use. We wanted it to be able to collect videos from anyone and anywhere. Of course, when we started working on it, we had no idea that it was going to become so important. But in some ways, the pandemic really pushed a lot of employers to try employee-generated content, more distributed forms of content, much earlier than they would have otherwise, because frankly, there was no alternative. Nobody's coming into your office to create, a packaged piece of recruitment content. You have to be a little bit more organic. And I actually think that matched up with candidate trends. Our data consistently shows that people prefer information from employees that feels less staged or less produced. I think Edelman does their annual trust barometer, and it turns out that the #1 aspect of companies that is most trusted is the kind of individual employees themselves. They're much more trusted than the CEO, the press team, the leadership team. So putting your employees front and center has always been so important. But I think during COVID, employers let go of the reins a little bit, and that was a really, really powerful thing. We've also seen just this growing awareness that companies that do not treat their employees well will be punished. And I think if you go back, 20 or so years, there were far fewer consequences for employers that did not respect their employers or did not treat them as well. If you were a major employer, you might be written about in the newspaper, and that could be very bad, but most companies were just not big enough and information wasn't as easily shareable. Now, I don't know how many people are TikTok followers, but there was a large company that laid a number of people off over Zoom. Several people on TikTok recorded the video, posted it to Zoom. Others started reposting it with parodies and commentary. And suddenly, this organization had a real PR crisis on their hands that I think went much further and became much bigger than it would have in definitely 10 years ago and really a couple more. So I think because the pandemic was such a shared painful experience, it heightened this focus on what is the contract between employers and employees? What does an organization owe its people? And again, employees with choices, which is not every employee, but it is most of the employees that we want to hire, those individuals who have the skills that a lot of companies are going after them. They're starting to ask questions in interviews like, how did your company handle the pandemic? Did you have to lay off staff? How did you treat them? What was the response? And I think that awareness that future candidates are watching your choices, I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of employers, but I think it's the future. And I think, I happen to believe that it is a good thing for all of us if there are clear market incentives for employers to just treat their people better. I think it's good business. I think it's great ethics. And I also think it's going to lead to a world with ultimately better performance because as anyone, who's managed knows, you can get much better performance out of a team who is bought in, who is motivated, who feels respected than you can with a team that is, led by fear or there to collect a paycheck or some of these other kind of old school management philosophies that I think we're seeing fall increasingly out of favor.
It's also better for your karma.
Yes, we're here.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Art, I'm curious from the technologist standpoint, kind of in the same vein. She mentioned how candidates, it's important for employers to show up to candidates well beyond just the organization's outward-facing brand. But when it comes to technologists, what other information are they looking for when they are evaluating organizations that they might want to work for?
I can give you 3 distinct answers because I think it's really critical that people understand this. The first is you should expose your tech stack, and I'm going to explain what that means. Number 2, you should describe your release schedule, also describe what that means. And then number 3, talk about the influence of artificial intelligence and machine learning inside of your environment. Let me go back to number 1. So what I described earlier is that most technologists view any distinct skill as having a half-life of about 5 years. It means that there's not a lot of COBOL programmers out there. There's not a lot of Fortran programmers out there. People want to be coding in the latest, greatest environment. So for example, for DHI Group, when we describe our architectural tech stack, our technology components that make up our software platforms, we say that we're building scalable platforms on AWS, that's super important, Amazon Web Services, using serverless, event-driven microservices on Lambda. In fact, Lambda is one of the most cutting-edge forms of technology out there, and that automatically triggers the notion that people are working on something that's cutting edge, that's right out on the frontier of technology. We also talk about our mobile environment, our UX, UI design standards, and then also machine learning, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. The second thing is the release schedule. So no technologist wants to be working on a project that's going to be released and that they can tell their friends about in 2 years. When I came on board roughly 3.5 years ago, DICE had not had a major release for more than 4 years, to my knowledge, which is just unbelievable. We have changed our architectural standards. We've changed everything about our technology group so that now we have a major release every single quarter on each one of our platforms, and we have minor releases hundreds of times per year. And the latest environment for doing so is called continuous integration, continuous deployment, CI/CD. That allows programmers to know that what they are coding is going to make it out into the platform immediately. And so they feel like they have a sense of progress, a real sense of pace. And you might say, well, that probably puts a lot of pressure on people to essentially deliver continuously. The environment is what's called agile today, And so there is a 2-week sprint cycle generally for most technology firms. People want to know that what they're coding is going to be released in 2 weeks. That's a big part of what they consider to be their own self-perception of worth if you're a technologist. Now, coming back to the third answer is, you know, the world is moving rapidly towards artificial intelligence and machine learning. And that's probably under an umbrella term of data science in general. But most technology companies have embraced artificial intelligence, machine learning in some way. And if they haven't, they will do so within the next 24 months, guaranteed. There's so much that can be done with machine learning specifically that any company that's not on a path towards machine learning will be a bystander in their own environment. So again, if you're trying to talk to technologists, always talk about your tech stack with a very deep and intelligent answer. Always describe how often you're going to be releasing code, and always describe your general strategy around artificial intelligence, machine learning, because it's going to be part of their future, and they know it right now.
That's so helpful to have that insight, Art. Thank you so much. As we get close to the top of the hour, I'm going to pose this final question to both of our panelists. It's about buy-in. Culture can't be limited to HR alone. How can HR professionals and others who are closest to the hiring generate buy-in from others within an organization, and and to focus on how to show the organization is showing up as an employer? Kathryn, we'll go to you first.
Sure. This is such an important question. And I think, first of all, we could spend an entire hour just talking about the process of getting your organization on board, communicating to members of the leadership team. But a few of the things I would say is, first of all, to highlight the impact on employee retention that this issue has. It's very well known that one of the top reasons for particularly short-term employee churn, meaning someone who joins and then leaves within the first 12 months, is a mismatch in expectations. So whatever data you can gather about employee churn under 12 months at your organization is a really, really powerful data point. That is some of the most painful churn, because you have spent a lot of time and money recruiting someone, onboarding them, training them, and they leave before they've done almost any work for you in a lot of cases. Looking at retention more broadly and being able to tie that to how you're communicating your brand, your culture, your values is also important. I also think this is a great opportunity. We talked earlier in this session about listening to your people, gathering data from surveys, through other employee feedback tools, through in-person focus groups. The more that you can take that elsewhere in your organization and say, look, this is how we're perceived. This is the impact of some of the things that we haven't gotten right, or this is the impact of a mismatch in what we're saying and what we're doing. The more I think you can tie this very important issue to the bottom line. And so again, we could talk about this for an hour, but I think that those are the two things that I would put at the top of my list.
Love that answer, Kathryn. And for my answer, I would say I wholeheartedly agree that this issue is not the responsibility of HR alone. I would say, however, and have said it publicly, that I believe an HR team in today's environment has worked 3 times as much as they would regularly work in a normal year. And so I would go out of your way to thank your HR team. We're sending every single member of our HR team a very nice bottle of champagne this year at the end of the year, just to say, we know that it's been an incredibly stressful environment where a lot of these issues have been resting on the HR team's shoulders, but they should not. And I would like to just piggyback and plus one on Kathryn's ideas that, in my opinion, the best way to engage the team is to make sure that the team has the right data. So for us, we have a monthly business review, and the HR section is intentionally set up to deliver metrics so that the rest of the leadership team really understands where we reside with regard to culture and hiring and trends. So the very first thing that we do is we say, are we on plan to our hiring budget? The second thing that we ask is, where is attrition against benchmark? And the benchmark for the technology industry is 22% per year That's the benchmark that precedes the pandemic and what most people are measuring themselves against. And where's the attrition happening? By team, by location. And then the third question that it's posed to answer is, are we hitting our DEI benchmarks? And are we hiring that way? Are we exposing all the right kind of candidates to the search using the tools that we have? And incidentally, I would point out that we went through an incredible amount of work to make sure that we're using the right DEI benchmarks. DEI is really sector specific. So you can't just take an overall DEI set of benchmarks and apply them to the technology industry, for example. You have to use a tech specific DEI benchmark. But you have to expose that data so that people understand what's happening real time, in my opinion, to really make this a team-based responsibility.
Great, thank you both. And it looks like we have just a couple minutes left. I just want to thank you both for being panelists today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to discuss all of these important topics. Like you both mentioned, we could talk about this for hours. So thank you for helping us scratch the surface. We did have some questions pop in. I apologize, we can't get to them today, but we will follow up with each of you. I want to thank each and every one of our attendees today who have joined the webinar. We hope that you've found this discussion really helpful and the tips that we've shared to be actionable. We'll be sending a recording of this webinar in the next 24 hours, as I mentioned at the top of the webinar. Please feel free to forward the email on to colleagues who you think might find it interesting and be able to use the information for their strategies in 2022. When the webinar ends, you will see a survey pop up. We would love to see and read your thoughts. We read every response, so we use them to help us make DICE webinars better for you. So please share your feedback and your thoughts. Thank you both again for being panelists today, and we hope everyone has a great rest of their week.
Thank you so much, all, and great to join both of you.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Kathryn.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Take care.